Pennington became an ADR loop group actress. She's the first of these we've had on the show, and it's not a job we think about much. Hello, and welcome to the 32nd episode of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at the 8th episode of Season 2, entitled Adventures in Paradise, Part 1. We're actually in production order this week, with production code number 208, and since this is a Part 1 episode, we will also be in production order again next week when we see Part 2. Speaking of being a multi-parter, this is actually our first two-parter of the series. We had a handful of multi-parters like this during Cheers, so it's not exactly new territory for the Frasier crew, but it is something we don't see that often. In fact, unless I'm mistaken, we won't get another two-parter until Season 4. I think there's something interesting to be said about compressing a storyline down into a single half-hour episode for most weeks, versus the kind of decompressed storytelling we see a lot more today, where plot lines like what we have here would be stretched out not just over the entire episode, but possibly over the whole season. But again, that's a whole other conversation. The title this week is most likely a reference to the 1959 series of the same name, Adventures in Paradise, which ran for 3 seasons and 91 episodes, and chronicled the misadventures of a Vietnam vet turned captain of the ship the Tiki-3 in the South Pacific. This episode originally aired on November 15th, 1994. The ratings this week are a nice improvement over last week, but still not fantastic. Frasier pulled in 21.8 million viewers, a nice climb of over 2.5 million from the previous episode, and a hair above the season average. At the same time, Seinfeld is just dominating in the ratings. It brought in a massive 32.4 million viewers and completely decimated all the competition by nearly 10 million viewers. And Seinfeld wasn't the only series doing really well this week. We had another James Burrows directed episode of Friends, and it beat Frasier again this week as well, this time by well over 1 million viewers. Looking ahead at the season average for Friends, the series isn't going to be quite the juggernaut Seinfeld is, but it is going to be above Frasier quite a bit going forward, which is kind of disappointing if I'm being honest. It's also interesting that all 3 shows existed simultaneously on NBC and all pulled in pretty good ratings. James Burrows, in classic Burrows manner, was keeping himself really busy this week, directing both this and part 2 of this episode, in addition to his Friends episode we talked about a minute ago. It's honestly amazing just how many episodes of television the man is able to direct in a standard television season, all while maintaining a high quality for all of them. To complement Burrows' direction this week, we have the returning writing team of Ken Levine and David Isaacs, who we last saw in the Season 1 episode, The Show Where Lilith Comes Back. And given the plot twist at the end of this episode, I can't help but feel they were the perfect pair to pick for this outing. This is the second of 7 episodes Levine will write, and the second of 9 Isaacs will write. Much to my shock, this episode starts out with another new introduction for the season, with a lightning bolt streaking across the sky. This is the 8th introduction we've seen overall, and the 4th new one for the season. We've now seen every introduction from Season 1 repeated in Season 2, except the Nothing Happening intro. I'm guessing this really is the last new one, and we'll get the Nothing Happening one next week. But I was wrong about this one, so who knows? We open on our guest caller scene, and boy, do we have an interesting guest caller this week with Art Garfunkel. Garfunkel has done a handful of spots on television and in movies, from 1970 all the way to the modern day. And surprisingly, out of all those appearances, only one of them has featured him playing himself. Garfunkel isn't really known as an actor, though. He's best known as a musician. And one half of the musical group, Simon and Garfunkel, which features both him and Paul Simon doing excellent harmonies and creating some truly wonderful music together. Simon and Garfunkel have been active on and off since 1956, and have toured together as recently as 2009. In 2018, Paul Simon said he had officially retired from touring and wouldn't do it again. Art Garfunkel has spent most of his life in music, but that doesn't mean his music hasn't had contributions to Hollywood. One of his most famous contributions to Hollywood is the soundtrack for the 1967 Academy Award-winning film The Graduate, for which he and Paul Simon did all the vocal music on the soundtrack. Interestingly, the song Mrs. Robinson was a work in progress at the time they were hired to work on the film, and the original lyrics was only a placeholder and used the name Mrs. Roosevelt. In his spare time, Garfunkel is an avid reader and has actually kept track of every book he's read since 1968, and this list is posted on his website. During his time reading, Garfunkel discovered he really liked poetry, and in 1989, he released a poetry collection entitled Stillwater. During his career, Garfunkel has won 8 Grammys, been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and found himself ranked as the 86th greatest singer of all time, according to the Rolling Stone. We haven't had that many pure music guest callers, and Art Garfunkel is definitely a cool addition to the list. I only wish the producers were able to get Paul Simon on at some point as a guest caller too, in order to complete the duo. The impetus for a lot of this episode is from Seattle Magazine, which is listing their hottest 100 men and women in the city. Seattle Magazine is one of the real-life media presences on the show. Seattle was first published in 1964. Strangely, this isn't where the Seattle Magazine we're seeing here originated. Instead, it originated 2 years later, in 1966, with Pacific Search magazine, which was largely a scientific magazine. Now, here's where things get kind of confusing. Pacific Search did okay, but not great. And in 1980, it was rebranded as Pacific Northwest. This change in title attracted a lot more readers and advertisers, and led to a change in the magazine's structure that shifted it away from the scientific parts of the earlier magazine and into a more popular style of articles and features, including the first 6 cartoons published by Far Side creator Gary Larson. In 1987, thanks to the magazine's growing success, it was sold to the New Jersey-based company Micromedia Corp., which in turn was sold to Adams Publishing in 1992, which in April of 1993 merged Pacific Northwest with their own magazine, Greater Seattle, into just Seattle Magazine, which we see here. We get quite a few good shots of the cover of this issue, as Frasier and Roz are reading through it, and we can even tell that the cover story says, "Guess who's coming to dinner?" I was hoping I could find out a bit more about this issue, or at least the month it came out in, but unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a good catalog anywhere of back issues of Seattle Magazine, so all I can say for sure, based off eBay listings I was able to find, is this is not the February or October 1994 issue. There's another great Bulldog appearance this week. This is his 10th of 53 appearances on the show, and he's got a couple great jokes here, which are a little different, but just as obnoxious as everything else we've ever seen from him. The first joke involves him smacking his butt and referring to them as his cherry tomatoes. This is a nice physical gag for him, and the kind of humor we don't get a lot of on Frasier. The second gag is just a background one, but it's completely ridiculous and really cracked me up. It's Bulldog holding the Seattle Magazine sideways like he's looking at a centerfold. It makes no sense, especially as we've seen a few glimpses of the interior of the magazine, and it's clear there's no sideways pictures, which just makes it all the funnier and more ridiculous. The final thing worth mentioning we get from Bulldog this week also comes from Roz. It's not exactly a reaction shot, but it's the best facial acting of the episode, as both of Frasier's co-workers watch him anxiously to see if the girl from the magazine says yes to going on a date with him. Our next scene opens with what will be a subplot for the remainder of the episode, and that's Martin's box of Cuban cigars. The box he opens is a Hoyo de Monterrey cigar box, which is in fact a box of Cuban cigars. The Hoyo are an old brand of cigar dating all the way back to 1865, and the fascinating thing is they've been handcrafted the entire time. Nothing machine-made about these cigars. Now, I'm not a smoker, so I'm not exactly sure how much cigarettes or cigars cost, but I think it's safe to say on average it's nowhere near as much as these guys do. Today, a box of 20 of these cigars costs $165, which is over $8 a cigar. We talked at length about smoking on television during my review of Dukes We Hardly Knew Ye, but I still feel the need to call it out here. For a relatively family-friendly show like this, it still feels incredibly off to me to see it happening, even if it was nothing to write home about at the time it came out. We have a pretty good Eddie joke this week that involves Eddie hiding Frasier's socks in various places and Frasier instructing him to bring them back. It's a nice new use of Eddie, and my only real complaint with it is Frasier's socks are clearly knotted here, so Eddie can carry them, but it's been established in the past that Frasier doesn't knot his socks when he does his laundry. But for the sake of the joke, it's really not a big deal, just one of those little oddities worth mentioning. Moving into Frasier's date, we find Frasier and Madeline at a restaurant called Degas. This isn't one of the real restaurants, this is another of those fictitious ones we find so often on the show. Frasier's date, and the 37th hottest woman in Seattle, is played by Jo Beth Williams, who was actually a guest caller way back in episode 8 of season 1, in the very strong episode, Beloved Infidel. We talked about her at length there, so I don't want to get into her again here, other than to say it's nice to see the poltergeist and stir-crazy actress return, as she's a strong acting presence to have on the show. I'm going to butcher the French language again here as we take a quick break to talk about wine. Frasier and Madeline bond over wine and talk about the differences between an 88 and an 89 Chateau Neuf du Pape. Madeline says the 88 is better, despite the fact that Frasier ordered the 89, which according to her is the second best. The market seems to disagree with her here on the front of wine superiority. The 88 currently costs about $200 a bottle, while the 89 is around $275 a bottle. Either way, they're both expensive wine. For the sake of comparison and pricing, a 3-year-old bottle of Chateau Neuf du Pape costs around $100 today. As Frasier's date plays out, we get a whole slew of guest stars as the French family and their drama play out as a fun little background subplot. The first member of the family we meet is Etienne Degas, who owns the restaurant. He is played by Pierre Epstein. Epstein, no relation, is primarily an actor. He's been in over 15 Broadway shows and numerous television and movie roles since 1960, including Ron Howard's Splash, Kate and Alley, L.A. Law, An Indecent Proposal, Beverly Hills, 90210, ER, and The Blacklist. He was born in France in 1930 and will be turning 94 this July. The busboy, and the father of Degas' grandchild, is played by Rick Schatz. Schatz is an extremely minor actor, who only has 9 roles to his name, including this, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and ER. He was active in Hollywood on and off from 1992 until 2006. While the busboy is attempting to refill Frasier's water, there is some yelling in French off-screen. The yelling translates to, "So what are you telling me?" From there, the conversation switches to English, although it is somewhat accented, which is admittingly the point, and led to me being a little confused about what was happening there at first. Ultimately, this leads us to the introduction of the mother and daughter in the Degas family. The mother is played by Kirsten DeVere, who was an extremely minor actress, active only in the early and mid-90s. The only shows of note she appeared in are Murphy Brown and General Hospital. The daughter, Yvette, is a little more interesting, and is played by Jessica Pennington. This is a super early role for Pennington, and is in fact only her 3rd credited acting role. She'll have a handful more acting roles, including spots on The West Wing, Gilmore Girls, and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. But her acting career is fairly small and not what I wanted to discuss here. In 2006, with the Adam Sandler film Click, Pennington became an ADR loop group actress. She's the first of these we've had on the show, and it's not a job we think about much. ADR stands for Automated Dialogue Replacement. This is basically voiceover acting or dubbing, but done to match a particular actor or actress. So it's not obvious that the dubbing was done, unlike, say, Tommy Wiseau's 2002 masterpiece The Room. Pennington has become a master at this, and has nearly 100 ADR credits to her name. She's voice matched multiple actresses, including Julia Roberts, Natalie Portman, Tessa Thompson, Idina Menzel, and Scarlett Johansson. She's worked with all the biggest studios and has worked on ADR positions in movies varying from Sex and the City, to Knowing, to Divergent, to Focus, to Blade Runner 2049. She's got a really cool job, one that doesn't get discussed much, and one I'm glad we got the chance to talk about a bit here, and shine a tiny spotlight on an underappreciated part of the filmmaking process. This scene, ultimately, turns into Frasier counseling the family. It's funny and cute, but it's kind of a weird distraction from what would otherwise be just a first date scene. Before I move out of the scene, I just want to call out what I found to be a nice and clever piece of dialogue, while Mr. DeGoss is getting more and more worked up about who the father is. He says he's going to snap his neck like a baguette. There's really nothing else to say here, other than I think it's a great and clever line to have for a French chef. From there, we have a time jump of 2 weeks, where Frasier and Madeline have fallen really hard for each other, and Roz is pretty jealous. It's interesting that Roz's jealousy comes from a dating drought. We know she's got a little black book, just like Sam, so it's kind of weird she's having so many issues finding a date. Especially when Noel is still around, and I'm sure he'd be more than happy to go out with her. We get some really good on-screen chemistry between Williams and Grammer here, as they try to schedule a date for them to take a weekend away together. It's a really good joke, and shows just how good the chemistry is between the pair of them. Our nice certified B-plot between Niles, Martin, and Daphne continues, and outside of the strangeness of having smoking on television, this is just plain fun. It's really nice to see Martin and Niles bonding, as 95% of the father and son bonding we've seen thus far has come between Martin and Frasier. So it's nice to get to see some of that between Niles and him for a change. It's also really cool to get to see Niles just being actually friendly with Daphne, as opposed to the type of friendliness he usually shows her. Okay, look, it's still plenty sexual and flirtatious, but it's also actually a foundation for a relationship beyond that. What is beyond a doubt my favorite Niles joke of the episode is when Frasier is worrying about if he's moving too fast and making a mistake going on a vacation with Madeline, and Niles says he doesn't want to get stuck in a comfortable old Maris. It's a Freudian slip that's absolutely brilliant, and shows more of exactly where Niles' head is when it comes to his wife. I can't help but draw comparisons between Niles' marriage and Norm's on Cheers, and not just for the superficial reason that neither of the women are ever actually seen, but largely because neither of the men seem like great husbands. But based on what we've seen, they both do actually love their wives. One final thing of note before we get to Frasier's vacation is we get to learn the story of how Martin met his wife, and it's at a crime scene. It's not actually possible Martin met his wife in the way described, as real crime scenes don't use chalk outlines. This is just a TV thing, but it doesn't make the meet cute any less endearing. And it's a nice bit of background info to add to the series and Martin's mythos. We get some nice romance between Frasier and Madeline on their vacation before we get a cliffhanger ending that made my jaw drop and left me thrilled to see what comes next. And that's Frasier's horrible luck that BB Newworth's Lilith is staying right next door to Frasier. We talked about Newworth at length in the first episode where Lilith came back, and it's really nice to see her again here. I know Ted Danson will be back later this season, but I wasn't expecting any other Cheers appearances before that, so I was really excited and surprised to see her here. The coda is fine and a nice Roz moment, but it's not really necessary, as we've already seen Roz making calls to people in the magazine. We obviously weren't going to see anything else from the Frasier-Lilith storyline for the coda, but I think it would have worked better if we maybe got a scene of Niles attempting and failing to blow smoke rings. But that's just my opinion on the coda this week. On the tie front, Frasier sports 3 ties this week, while Niles wears 2. 2 out of 3 of Frasier's ties are new here, while his second tie is making its second appearance, after first showing up just 4 episodes ago. While being part of a genuine B-plot, Niles manages to be 2 for 2 on new ties this week. This brings the total new tie count up to 37 to 36, with Frasier still slightly in the lead. This is an interesting episode. We've seen a few episodes with Frasier pursuing a love interest in the past, but none quite like this. This is by far the strongest relationship pairing we've seen with Frasier since his divorce, plus or minus his non-relationship with Rebecca during Cheers' last season. There's a lot of good here. We have a really cool guest appearance with future ADR actress Jessica Pennington, a real-life B-plot that provides some nice relationship building between all three non-Frasier members of the Crane clan, and a hysterical Freudian slip from Niles. The on-screen chemistry between Jo Beth Williams and Kelsey Grammer is fantastic, and one of the highlights of the episode, and the final scene cliffhanger is the perfect ending for the first two-parter of the series. If you just need to get away from it all, even just for 24 minutes, give this 9 out of 10 episode of Frasier a watch.